Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Burn Network. I am of Positive Fandom and the Burn Network, and I'm so delighted to bring to you today the first of a show that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. This show is a special show on the PGS where we look at the IPs that are out there in science, fantasy, horror, and things that we love here on the Burn Network. And today we're going to be talking about one of the most famous IPs out there, Planet of the Apes, everybody. Certainly, many of you have heard that there's a new film coming out. And so that's why we're meeting here to talk about this franchise that we love. And I do want to introduce my guest, starting with Retro Nerd Girl. Retro Nerd Girl, welcome. And how are you today?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I'm so glad you're here. We also have my wing girl, Lorena Creole. Lorena, how are you today?
I am doing great. I'm doing great. So glad to be here with all of you to talk about what has to be one of my favorite film franchises.
Wonderful, wonderful. And of course, we have the incomparable Kamran, Pasha, the writer, producer, and just such a wonderful friend and fantastic commentator on what I consider one of the most important areas of science fiction and fantasy, essentially bringing us to interpret and understand a lot of these IPs. Cameron, how are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm delighted to be on your channel as always, and it's always lovely to see Lorena Creole, who I have a deep friendship with, and Retro Nerd Girl. Hopefully, this will begin a journey of a friendship. We haven't met
Yes,
before.
hopefully, yes. It's my
Well,
pleasure to meet you.
It's great. I'm excited about this particular franchise because it is there's a reason that this thing doesn't die, and it keeps making movie after movie after.
hmm
It just doesn't. There's something we'll talk about why that is.
absolutely, Cameron, and Retro Nerd Girl and Lorena. You know, it's interesting to think about this IP, Planet of the Apes, and there are going to be people who may be watching a lot of these older films for the first time. Maybe they've watched the films from the 2000s, but they've never
Mhm.
seen some of the older retro films. And of course, there is a book that kind of started this all. But I like to explore the idea of what keeps bringing us back to Planet of the Apes franchise. And what I'd like is for each of you to describe the series as if you were describing it to someone for the first time, just in a few sentences. And in your opinion, over the years, has the franchise become more or less significant to you over time? Lorena, can you start off?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I will. For this particular franchise, I would say consider this. How different is man from beast? How different is man from the animals that you consider to be lower than or less than you? And is it that man is such a threat to himself that he's too blind to see it?
Hmm.
I think that definitely sums up the core theme of this entire world.
Mhm. Yeah, it does.
Interesting. And Lorena, do you feel that the franchise has become less or more important over time, or has it remained the same?
I will say it is not as prevalent, but it's still extremely, extremely relevant. I'll take that back a little bit. We'll just say there's a certain franchise that has sort of overshadowed this one because they took the idea and they elevated it, and that would be Jurassic Park franchise.
Ah, very
That's an
Mm,
interesting analogy. I never made that analogy, but that's
yeah,
opened up all
interesting.
these interesting thoughts. Yes.
that is fantastic, and we definitely should talk about that today. Um, Cameron, you
Mhm.
and I have been talking about this franchise for a while, and honestly, when I first heard about Planet of the Apes, I found out about the first film, and just like many of you, then I found out there was a second one and a third and a fourth and a fifth, and then the excitement built up because you're like, they're already there. These movies exist. So it was fun to see that. And obviously, it's not the norm to see so many films in duration or succession that were made so successfully. They did well in the box office. And I did want to talk about the first film that seemed to kind of be the breakout film, Planet of the Apes, 1968, because it was written by Rod Serling. And Kamran, you have written for the Twilight Zone series, the remake, and you understand kind of Serling's style. And I wanted to find out, in your opinion, just, did Serling set the tone for this franchise as we see it in the film version, in your opinion?
Well, I think one of the things that Rod Serling did is he opened us up to a world of mystery and surprise twists. He actually, this movie is based on a novel that came out, I believe, in 1963 in French, and then was translated in English. And however, Rod Serling had already changed our perception of reality with the Twilight Zone in the 1950s, in advance of this book, right? It was 1955 to 1959, so it was about 4 years the Twilight Zone was on. It feels like it was on for 100 years, and Serling wrote a majority of those episodes, and he was an absolute genius, and that series became famous for its surprise twist, right? A surprise twist, not just for the sake of the twist, but a twist that would make you think about the morality of the episode in a new way, right? And about what it means to be human. That's what made those shows. They still work. If you watch those original Twilight Zone shows, they still will punch you in the stomach, right? Here 67 years later. And so he created an audience for that kind of storytelling en masse. So he created a culture, in my opinion, in which the Planet of the Apes novel could be written. Right. I'm not so sure that it would have become the massive success. How many French novels do Americans read? Right. How many French novels were Americans reading in the 1960s? And yet this became a worldwide successful novel. And it had that twist. Here's a spoiler alert for those who are unfamiliar with the Planet of the Apes, is that in the story, we should at least clarify the story for those who don't know it, or at least just establish a foundation. Right. The story is about an astronaut, even just going back to the original novel. The story is about an astronaut who is sent into deep space, who crash lands on a planet where he's captured and discovers that the dominant species is actually an evolved, form of ape. The different apes, chimpanzees, they all have different roles. The chimpanzees are the scientists in the society. The gorillas are the sort of the muscle. They're the generals, the military guys, right? So your orangutans are there, and they can all communicate. They all speak. And what he's shocked to discover is human beings are essentially animals in this world. They're mute. In the original novel, they're naked. They can't actually show that in the 1960s movie. And so they're all wearing sort of primitive, caveman clothing. But in the novels, they're naked. They're essentially beasts, right? And they are treated like that. They're treated with contempt, by the ruling ape class. And then when they capture these humans who they think are animals, when the humans start speaking, that frightens them, because that is so shocking to them that they essentially imprison them and experiment on them. Who are these human animals that can speak, right? And then eventually one of the ape scientists realizes they're not from our world, and we got to get them out of here, right? Because they're, the world is a threat to them, and they're a threat to our world, right? And in the novel, the scientists actually, the astronauts escape and get back on their rocket and take off, right? Or at least the main astronaut does. He takes off and he returns to Earth. And because, we're doing with Einsteinian time, thousands of years have passed in the time that is taken to go from this other star system back to Earth. And he lands on Earth. And when he emerges from the rocket, military people come to greet him because he's landed on this landing pad, right? And he's horrified to see that they're gorillas.
Yeah.
Right? Earth has become this as well. So it's set on another world, and he comes back thousands years later to discover Earth has followed the same trajectory. And the last thing is he gets in his rocket and he takes off. He doesn't know where to go now, right? There's nowhere left for being human, right? So that's a very powerful book, very powerful ending. And the movie has a twist on it, a very Serling-esque twist. So the movie comes out 5 years later, with Charlton Heston in this unforgettable role as a scientist, right? And they land on this planet, and they go through all the process. They're enslaved by apes. They escape. But the difference in the movie and this ending was, you see, another screenwriter came in and rewrote Rod Serling, because his initial script, my understanding is, followed the book very heavily. And in the book, the apes were in an advanced technocratic society. They had all kinds of scientific advancements and things like that. And in the novel, they couldn't do that. In the movie, they didn't have the money. So they said, why don't we rewrite Serling's draft and make it, the apes are more primitive. They're more like Middle Ages human beings.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have that kind of extreme technology. In fact, they fear technology. We discover why, right? Because at the surprise ending that is the original Serling ending,
Mm-hmm.
changed the novel, is that instead of taking off from the planet, they basically escape from the ape society into the forbidden zone, this area that no one is allowed to go into. And the final moment is one of the most memorable moments in cinematic history, where Charlton Heston, he's riding a horse in there, and he's shocked by what he sees in the forbidden zone. And he climbs off his horse, and he just starts wailing, hitting the ground, and saying, "You idiots, you fools, you did it, you destroyed us, right?" And then we pan back and we realize he's looking at the statue.
Yep.
He's not in another world; he's in a future Earth. I mean, he got caught in
Mm-hmm.
Abyssinian travel, right? And he returned to Earth, not knowing it was Earth. And so that's the surprise twist of the movies, which hit people really hard because it's even more poignant than the French novel to many people, right? Because this whole time, and that's a pure Twilight Zone episode, where he was never off Earth. He didn't know it, right? And so that's very much a Rod Serling invention. And I've worked on, as you mentioned, there have been many iterations of Twilight Zone. There's one in the 80s, which was actually an excellent show. And then I worked in the early 2000s, early aughts, I guess, with Forrest Whitaker, who was the host of that show. I worked on the UPN version of it, and we did some good episodes. I'm very proud of the episodes I wrote, and we did some good episodes that I think Serling would have liked. And then now there's been a more recent one, which not everyone is excited about, the more recent one that came out, but I'm proud of the one that we did. But we very much wanted to honor that kind of thing where it's social commentary along with twist. Or, the twist is not just for the sake of a twist. Something like the Twilight Zone, something like the Sixth Sense is a twist, but it's not exactly Serling-esque. People complain compared to Serling. It's not because it's about the lesson is just for the person, right? Bruce Willis comes to terms with the fact that he himself is dead, right? Over the course of the movie. A true Serling thing is more about social commentary, right? It's like that famous episode where there's no time to read, right? There's this guy who
my favorite.
Yeah, he's obsessed with
Mm-hmm.
and then there's a nuclear holocaust, and he survives it because he's down in the basement of the library, and he's actually happy. There's no more human beings, and he's free of people. Now he has time to read, and he has all these books, and there's nobody to bother him. And he trips, and his glasses break, and he can't read. But that's a personal tragedy, right? But the deeper meaning is that, look, we human beings need each other, right? That's the social meaning, that he hated people so much he was happy to see us all die. But you need other people. You need someone to fix your glasses, right? No man is an island. So that's what Serling would do. He would take a personal tragedy and make it something that speaks about the human condition, right? And that's what I think the Planet of the Apes, that movie hit people so hard, because it hit many deeper things, which we're going to talk about today, the archetypal things that we fear and we hope for. And that's why it keeps spawning these sequels. It just doesn't stop.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, Kamran. And certainly I felt that because Serling set such a high mark for these films, continually the films that had to follow had to hit that mark time and time again. And many of them did, for certain, especially at a time where there was a lot of social commentary to be made. The films themselves were so spectacular from a science fiction point of view that it got its point across, but came over as incredibly entertaining. And so thank you for that. And Retro Nerd Girl, I have a question for you about this IP. And, Lorena, you had mentioned earlier Jurassic Park. For me, the one that I was comparing this IP to, that had been around maybe a little bit longer, around the same time, was Star Trek. And the reason why is because Star Trek has this way of dealing with problems where they'll present a number of different scenarios. And in the end, and almost all the time in the end, things work out in Star Trek. It's an idealized version of what we want society to be like, right, Retro Nerd Girl? But I've noticed that in Planet of the Apes, usually what happens is the worst case scenario.
Yeah, they're all downer movies.
Yeah.
Though it's a cautionary tale, I think that they did that for a reason. What do you think about that, Retro Nerd Girl? And what are we supposed to learn from that in regards to that presentation of the ending of a lot of these films?
I mean, well, the only thing I can really say about that is that it really gives you a lot of brain food, if you will, because you're still kind of processing what happened. Like, what did we just watch? Especially the first Planet of the Apes. It is just like, okay, you wonder about this world. You wonder what happened. You wonder about, what could have gotten society to the point where apes became the dominant species, and it, even in the other movies that followed, they told there was always a little story being told about what happened, and so other movies that came after kind of filled in those gaps quite a bit.
Yep.
And even though they were downers, you still had more curious questions to ask about, like, could our world become like that? What if giraffes became the dominant species? I mean, even though it's like apes are much closer to us, in relation to, actually, biologically, they're much closer to us. It just still triggers the mind, like, uh, you know, the apes in the movies are actually humans in the movie. If you kind of see, like, they're holding up a mirror to humanity in a way. They're making the same mistakes as humans are making. They're doing a lot of the same thing. A lot of the fear that they have of the other is there, and so we're getting sort of a lesson in humanity, learning about these apes. So I don't know. There's something very intriguing about these the kind of dystopian, sad ending, if you will, or the downer ending. They do make you think quite a bit about the story afterwards, rather than, oh, we settled everything and it's all peaceful and happy.
Yeah, well said. And you made a lot of good points with that for sure. Lorraine, I have a question for you now.
Mhm.
In these stories and pretty much in the entire series, there's a lot of comments we hear all the time, specifically things like, well, I don't believe it, and it's impossible. And, that can't be so, and those types of comments practically in every film. But I just thought it was very interesting that it's paired along with the acting of looking at the characters, the process where we see actors looking at one another and doing this incredible amount of gesturing, to an extent where it becomes incredibly important part of the film, whether someone makes eye contact or kind of, I think we all know these gestures so well. What did you think about gesturing to a person and the role that it plays in this particular franchise, especially from, let's say, the 1960s forms of gesturing to what we know about animal behavior today, and how it's kind of presented itself in this series?
Interesting that you should mention that, because one of the differences that I noticed between the 1968 version of Planet of the Apes and the Tim Burton version of the Planet of the Apes is that body language communication, that if you look at primates and how they communicate, just how prominent that is. One of my favorite conservationists ever since I was a kid, Dr. Jane Goodall,
Mhm.
learned so much from her. Anytime I would go to the zoo, one of my favorite exhibits was the primate exhibits, because how they look at each other, how they interact with each other. With humans, we use a lot with our speech. We use body language, but not as much as primates do, even from how they care for the younger ones,
Mhm.
even how more dominant males will try to come after females, even how dominant males challenge each other
Mhm.
when you look at their body language.
Mhm.
It's something that they did in the Tim Burton version that I think, due to maybe knowing more with respect to how primates are, when the Tim Burton version was done. In the 1968 version, I think part of it was a limitation with the masks, which they had. They kind of had to act through that. So they kind of had to use their body language as another way to get the acting across. It's like they had to act through that. I thought that was a very prominent thing because with primates, looking directly in the eye is a very big challenge. That is not something that if you do not, there's not a lot of facial contact, not a lot of dominant or a very aggressive body language unless you are trying to challenge someone or assert your authority. That type of thing doesn't happen. So I thought that was a very big part of the appeal of the film, a part of the communication between the characters, and to also establish why, of course, you have Charlton Heston's character, why he was such a threat. He wasn't a threat as much as the others were because, they were rendered mute because, lobotomy, so they couldn't really communicate. But Taylor did not. So he was very assertive and aggressive in his communication. And you can tell just how unsettled they were, even when it came down to, this is the truth. And it's just like, no, how dare you? You're in contempt. We're basically going to throw you out or basically execute you. But yeah, I do. Kind of a long roundabout discussion, but that is something that I noticed with the two. It helps pull the story along, and not only that, but in 1968, since they didn't really have as fine costuming to allow more animated movement, you needed to have that conflict, because if Taylor was just, oh, okay, I'm resigned to my fate, whatever, we really wouldn't have much of a movie, would we? His existence and his challenging, I would say, just the very tenet, even when it comes to their religion, because you notice they kept quoting a lot of scripture from their quote unquote sacred scrolls at the same time. So just his presence was a big deal, and the body language escalated that.
Yeah, I think that was perfectly said, Lorena. And it is interesting to hear what you said about that as well. And Cameron, I have a question for you. In Escape for the Planet Apes, and I know I said I wasn't going to single out individual films, but there is something that happens in this film. And of course, it's one of my favorites because Ricardo Montalban, I love that man.
Oh, wow.
It's one of my favorite movies, and he's a big part of it.
He takes over every movie he's part of. He's just who he is.
He really does. And what I noticed, though, so in the story, what happens? The baby is born, and they have to kind of hide the baby, and they put the baby in a zoo. And I thought to myself, this feels a little bit carny to me. Like kind of very odd thing for them to do. Let's say at that point, it doesn't mean that it isn't actually part of the story. It might actually be in the original book, for all I know. But to be honest with you, Cameron, at a certain point, I thought to myself, well, this is getting a little odd, and I'm not quite sure where they're going to go with this. And no sooner had we been informed, or at least we know that Ricardo Montalban is protecting this precious child, that someone says something about, well, we've got to find the kid and make sure that this child is eliminated, this horrible act. And they start to mention Herod, Cameron, Herod story.
Sure.
And I thought to myself, wow, we just went from a carnival to a circus, which is a kind of a fun thing. You go there, you see animals sometimes. If some places don't have them anymore, but you remember what this experience was like. It's supposed to be a fun, joyful place, only to find out that, there's this horrific act that they want to do. And I thought about it, about the sense or the notion of taking those biblical themes, as I mentioned, Herod, or anything of a historical nature that's teaching us a lesson. Cameron, what do you think of that use of Herod at a point where it did kind of feel a little, off kilter? I'm like, he's going to a circus, or this is strange. Cameron, what can you tell us about the role of some of these biblical lessons or historical lessons that we know well that you can find in this IP?
Well, thank you, because I definitely want to talk about that. So I'm going to talk specifically about the Herod idea, and then expand it to why I think this particular franchise is so archetypal, because it's ultimately a form. It's not just a form of religious storytelling. It actually reflects some of our religious stories and our fears about who we are and our role in human beings, in our destiny in the cosmos, right? In religious tones. So with regard to Herod, for most, so those who don't know, Herod was the king of Judea in the turn of the millennium, and the biblical accounts talk about how when the star of Bethlehem is seen and the Magi show up from the east and they're there to find the newborn baby Christ, they arrive, and they ask King Herod, where is born the king of the Jews, right? This new baby that's been born. Of course, Herod is the king of the Jews, right? And so he's like, find that baby and kill it, right? And of course, that's the Christ child. And then, and so this is an archetypal thing. It actually goes back to Pharaoh and Moses. Pharaoh, in order to prevent a savior to be born amongst the people, the Hebrews, he kills all the male children of the Israelites, right? So it's an archetypal story that pops up again and again in religious storytelling. And so here it's being used again. This idea of Caesar, the baby, is essentially the beginning of a new era, the beginning of a new millennium, right? The savior of, it's not the savior of the human race, right? It's the savior of the apes, right? And yet Herod is being used as human beings who are trying to stop this from happening are actually the villains, right? So that brings us back to what I think is the great primordial fear that the Planet of the Apes franchise touches in the human soul. So the story of Abel and Cain, which exists in the Bible, exists in the Quran, it's very much a universal story of the two sons of Adam, one who killed the other and brought murder into the world, right? And that Cain kills Abel, the favored son, who is a pacifist, and Cain is violent. And when God favors Abel, Cain kills him, right? And bringing murder and death into the world, explaining why human beings kill each other. Most species don't kill each other. There are some species like that will sacrifice their lives as part of a mating process, like the praying mantis and things like that. But the idea of competing tribes of species is certainly not as prevalent in the animal kingdom. I think it's interesting that we see apes. There will be one ape will wipe out the alpha of one gorilla will wipe out the alpha leader of another clan. He doesn't wipe out the clan. He essentially takes in the females and mates with them. He will generally kill the children of the other alpha, so wiping that lineage out. So there is, notice in primates there is this competition, but we are the species that will commit genocide, that will just wipe each other out, right, across the board, and that's kind of unique to human beings. And so this Abel Cain story explores this thing that makes us human, which is that we will kill each other and sometimes wipe out entire nations, right? And it comes out of that. So I'm going to give you an interpretation. I'm not in any way, for those who take the story literally, and many Muslims take the story literally, I'm not in any way questioning the literalness of the story, but I want to get to the deeper symbolic things of it. What I think the story emotionally reflects symbolically, right, is the last time human beings did this, when we shared the planet with another form of hominid, when we shared the planet with the Neanderthals. We were not the only human race on the planet. There were two.
Good
right?
point.
Yeah, the Neanderthals were our predecessor race. The evidence so far from archaeology, anthropology suggests they were probably more peaceful than us. I'm sure they hunted, but there's not a lot of evidence of intra Neanderthal warfare, right? They seem to be more passive community, and of course, Homo sapiens show up, and they were not a passive community. And we're like, oh, you human-like people that are human, that can talk, we can breed with them. There are Neanderthal genes, especially in Europe, still prevalent in the population. So we bred with them. They're human, right? They're not a form of human, but they're human. And we wiped them out. We took them out. We weren't going to share this planet with them, right? All the evidence suggests is that this seems to be a one-way wipeout. It doesn't seem to be them coming at us or us coming at them. It seems to be we show up, Neanderthals, oh, yeah, you're done. You're out of here, right? And we took them out. We wiped out another form of human race, and we wiped them off the face of the earth. We bred with them, so some of their genes are still there. But basically, we took that entire form of human off the planet, right? And that is the defining thing of how Homo sapiens became the only human species on the planet, right? One can argue that certain tribes and certain Aboriginal tribes may still be come from another lineage of hominid, right? They're still human, but like the Neanderthals were another form of human. Some of those tribes, pygmies and others, may have another evolutionary lineage, right? But basically, we are the dominant form of human that exists because we took care of everything else. And so as a result of that is, I think, our greatest fear. It is the deep primordial fear of the human race to have that done to them, because it's our guilt. It's the guilt of Cain, right? That we did this to others. We didn't share the planet with other human beings. We took them out. So this will be done to us. And I think that takes the form in science fiction all the Terminator movies, all the AI will destroy you, iRobot, all this stuff. That's all part of that. That's all part of that. But even prior to that, even more primordial than that is the idea of the animal kingdom that we have ruled, and often ruled with much cruelty, will flip on us and become the power brokers, right? And then we will be wiped out. And that deep primordial fear of being replaced is the reason for success. And I want to just end it off with one thing, that it's a fear that is real within religious traditions. From my religion, I'm a Muslim. From my religious tradition, the Quran actually has a verse which quotes God as saying to human beings as a warning that God says, if we wish, we can destroy all of you humans and replace you with a new creation. So it's a warning that if you're unrighteous, there's a verse in the Quran says, God says, don't be too proud that you're a human, that you're the creation of God, the pinnacle of creation. If we wish, if you displease us, if you become evil, we can destroy this entire human race and replace you with a whole new creation. So that idea is embodied in the Quran, one of the major scriptures of the world, that this is something that is a divine warning. That's why it's so fearful to us, right? Because we know that that is true on some level. We are not necessarily the pinnacle of history.
Yeah, that is certainly very interesting comments on that one, Cameron. Yeah, certainly something I'm going to have to even think a little bit more. You went in so depth with it, and it was excellent. Retro Nerd Girl, I have a question for you.
Okay.
So in one of the films, they talk about this discovery of apes that can speak, that have, let's say, higher cognitive power, if you will, as to be the biggest news since the lunar moon landing, which was around the time. If it had happened before or after, doesn't actually matter. The implication of this incredible news that stopped the entire world from what they were doing, and they were glued to the television. They're comparing the discovery of these, apes who can do this as being as incredible as that accomplishment. Would that discovery now be as relevant if it happened today?
I think so. I think it would be, I mean, we're already doing interesting things in labs all over the globe with simians. So I think that would be something that would render a lot of research, and people would want to know how, they would want to know why. I'm not so certain that they would get fearful, but more I mean, because uh, I think the issue is not the speech, but more, it can that a simian or ape think on a higher level than humans or equal to, because that's the problem. I mean, that's where people become afraid because that's what we're afraid of AI of doing. Like if we get an AI become or smart, what people are afraid of what the future that will come of that. And so I think um, the scientific discovery now, it would be interesting, but it would really matter how intelligent uh, we're talking, because that's where stuff gets done is the level of intelligence. And I love these movies. Some of the later ones really get into the different levels of how the apes become more and more intelligent, and that's really fascinating because they cause more and more damage, but also they become more like us, more prideful, more like wanting to protect and wanting to have their own. And you, at the end of the day, you're like, you end up siding with the apes. I mean, which is kind of wild. We're talking about movies uh, that are supposed to represent this really fearful idea, but especially Escape from the Planet of the Apes, and even the more recent versions of Planet of the Apes, like Rise and Dawn, and or they were excellently done to kind of make you root for the apes, because they showed the cruelty and the struggle they had, that were very human struggles, you
Hmm.
know. So I think that's where the fear really comes, is intelligence. And you know, if you have an ape that can say a few words, and there are apes that can sign today, there's
Hmm.
a lot
Yeah.
of them, and they can tell you what they want, what how they feel. There are actually experiments now, and I don't know if you guys have seen it, where cats and dogs have been taught how to speak through pushing different little levers, and they're able to
Hmm.
communicate with their owners. You know, I'm hungry. Let's go play. I love you. That, I mean, it's just kind of wild, but you know, all of the animals are thinking. We just don't know how they're thinking, because we don't know how to communicate with them, you know. So it's really fascinating science when you think about it. I mean, I guess
Hmm.
I'm a science fiction lover, so all of this is so exciting to me and fun.
Well, I want to actually build on what you just said there, Retro Nerdville, which is personally
Sure.
the most emotionally compelling one. The one that really hit me hard emotionally was this new Rise of the Planet of the Apes, so
Oh
the
yeah.
new trilogy, where you're first introduced to Andy Serkis as Caesar, the
Yes.
resetting of the story, where you see how it happened, and that essentially it's the result of human genetic experimentation that caused Caesar to become more advanced,
Hmm.
and he helps the other apes to become more advanced. And it's a very emotionally difficult movie because it's about test animals. It's about test animals in science, right? And how they're
Hmm.
tortured. And for many of the basic products we use in our day-to-day lives, or our cosmetics, our deodorant, all this stuff are tested on animals, and often to great suffering, right? And that's just a horrible part of the world we live in. And there's many that are unaware of it and don't want to be aware of it, and we should be aware of it. And so this movie really shows what happens when human beings show no empathy for other life, right? And then, but the other dark side of that, which they really explore, I mean, they've explored those in the earlier movies. The earlier movies were more actually about, I think, more about the Cold War, more about
Hmm.
the Holocaust. That was the greatest fear.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
especially Escape.
Escape, especially. I mean, yeah, and so it's, but these movies are about the newest Holocaust that I think we're facing today, which is, some of us would suggest we're going through right now, which is the danger of genetic engineering of viruses, the danger of genetic engineering of
Hmm.
pathogens and things like that, and being done by pharmaceuticals companies looking for cures, right? Not necessarily from coming from a place of a mad scientist seeking to spread disease in the world, right? But from people with ostensibly good intentions to solve problems, health issues, experiment on animals to do that, and it can lead to things that get out of control, which is very interesting. This movie, I think it was 2011,
Hmm.
10 years before the events that we all endured,
Yep.
what happens when viruses we don't understand enter into the thing, and whether those viruses were engineered or not remains a matter of debate. I certainly have my opinions on that, but that's for another video. But the issue, that the reason that movie hit so much is that human beings not only brutally mistreat these animals, but they've been doing that for a long time.
Yeah.
But what's unique about this film is, because of our scientific efforts to master the world and solve our problems, we end up creating a twofold problem.
Yep.
One is that we create this virus that ends up essentially devolving human beings, right? It kills off a substantial portion of the planet, and the survivors begin to lose cognitive ability, right? They revert back. They start losing speech. They start
Hmm.
losing. They devolve backwards, so that they become like animals that we saw in the first Planet of the Apes movies, the one we saw in the novels, where they cannot communicate, right? And they're essentially like animals. Their level of cognitive understanding is no longer at the level of Homo sapiens. And then the second thing is, it then raises the intelligence of other simians, right? And so suddenly you've got the flip happening, where the apes are now have human intelligence and communication abilities. And
Hmm.
the one thing that's even made clear in that first movie is that even a chimpanzee without the ability to communicate is a very dangerous animal. I mean, they can rip your face off. I mean, they've got
Hmm.
physical strength much greater than a human being, right? And they can kill you with much more ease than a human being trying to kill you with their bare hands, right? It's very easy imagine if a chimpanzee with that level of physical strength gets human intelligence,
Mm.
and the movies make it clear they're not stoppable.
Hmm.
If they have human intelligence, the only thing that's prevented them from taking over the planet is that we have this higher cognitive ability. If they have our cognitive ability, they're a physically superior race, and they would wipe us out. And so, again, both those things happen because of human beings playing God, right? And so, like the Cronenberg,
Hmm.
you want to play God, you God will take all of you away, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a story, the Tower of Babel, right? Genetic engineering is arguably the form of the Tower of Babel today, of human beings attempting to, Tower of Babel is building a tower to confront God, essentially, to challenge God, go up to heaven. And then God punishes human beings by causing them to lose their unified language and be unable to communicate with each other. Look at this. We lose our ability to communicate in the scenario by our effort to challenge God in creation. We devolve to animals, and he creates a new race that replaces us. That is why these recent movies are so relevant to the moment and why they're so powerful for us.
Yeah, they're fantastic.
Exactly. And Lorraine, I have a question for you, and it has to do with obviously looking at this entire IP, looking at all the movies, and kind of looking at it from the point of view that initially, or at least it felt like it was going to be this kind of anthology series, where you'd get one film and maybe the second film might not connect to it, but it seems like they feel somewhat episodic at points. And oftentimes in IPs, they try to do the episodic thing, but it doesn't always work out for whatever reason. Why do you think that this particular IP happened to be blessed with the notion, or at least this feeling of flow that we get from film to film, even when we get the reboot, this incredible reboot, if you want to call it that, the old one, and then let's say later on, it still has this incredible flow to it. How do you think they were able to really achieve this? And do you think that makes the IP more relevant?
That's a very good question. I want to say that with the Planet of the Apes films, we'll go back to the first trilogy that they had. They respected what they built on, number one, and kept hooking you in, like, what's going to happen? Can things get any worse? What's the next thing that's going to happen? It keeps you invested no matter which one that you saw. That's why I know when I first saw the first one, it's like I was a kid. It's like we couldn't afford cable. So you get the movies on the weekends, and anytime it was Planet of the Apes, which one is it? I don't care which one it is. I have to see all of them because you're so invested in finding out what's going to happen next. How are the apes going to evolve? How is humanity going to survive if it's going to survive? So I think keeping that level of, I would say, anxiousness in a way, kind of like how it's paced with a horror movie, so to speak. Is this person going to survive? What's going to happen next? They keep that tension consistent with every single installment. And when it came to the Tim Burton reboot, kind of like that same thing, that same aesthetic. When it started, it gave you that callback to the one that was in 68. What's going to happen with the apes? How is this all going to come together? Because, like, for example, the one with the Tim Burton one with Mark Wahlberg, the ending of that one, I did not see coming. I mean, I'm like, what is going to beat the 68 version, the end of that one, where it's just like they blew up the whole planet? He shows up and apes have taken over the whole world. The reality he comes back to, even the Lincoln Memorial. When you see that, that's in the form of the
and that's a direct thing from the original novel. Is you return to Earth to discover it's already it's happened here too.
It was absolutely brilliant. And then going on to the most recent one, which that one really hit me for exactly the reasons that Kamran was talking about. Humans playing God. And we saw this in Jurassic Park as well, when Dr. Ian Malcolm is like, you're so obsessed with that you didn't stop to think, should you do this? And that scene where they're just like, oh yeah, the medication works, no problem. Tell the board, could be great. We're going to sell it. We'll make tons of money. It's perfectly and totally safe. And while they're giving the soft shoe and the cell and everything, that one gorilla's just killing people, just schizophrenic, just because of this particular drug that they did. And your heart just like breaks. And it's just like, if they get that kind of intelligence, what's going to happen to humans? So I think the fact that they've been able to tap into that fear in every single movie and show us something different with each subsequent movie. I think that's why it has such staying power.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, those were excellently done movies. The trilogy, the last trilogy, just I think the journey of uh of Caesar really feels a lot like, to me, and you mentioned biblical, it really feels like Moses,
Sure.
because at the end it kind of leads
Mm,
everybody to the promised land, but he never does get to enjoy it himself, which kind of also reminds me of Andor, when uh Luthen says he's doing all of the things that he's doing because he wants to give other people a sunrise he'll never see. So he's doing he goes through all of this stuff, horrible sacrifices,
Mhm.
just to see some other people, or other apes, go
mhm.
on and live a happy life in this, beautiful, like, as I said before, promised land. It's so good.
But what's also great is that in these movies they show, and they showed them they showed them in the original, they showed them in the novel, the apes are just like humans, divided. There are apes that are sympathetic to the human plight.
Mhm.
A lot of apes that are just as threatened, right? But what's interesting in the recent movies is that you have the adversary. I forget the name of the ape that had been tortured in particular. That
Coda.
was the
Oh,
Yeah,
is it Coda? Was it
yeah,
Coda? Okay.
Koba. I think it was
Koba,
Koba.
yeah,
Koba,
Koba.
yeah,
Koba.
Koba,
And so
yeah,
this is an ape that hates human beings and wants to wipe them out, and he's got good reason. He's been
yeah.
tortured. I mean, he's like lost an eye. I mean,
Mm,
Caesar didn't get the brunt of the animal experimentation. He did, right? So this is a guy who, understandably, has been severely damaged and seen the worst of human beings, and thinks that you got to get rid of them. And so it's not just that human beings are a threat, in a sense of some kind of racial threat. It's a direct personal threat. He was tortured by them, and
Mhm.
this is, again, consequences. Very biblical, and literally an eye for an eye. I think a Koba doesn't have an eye, right? And so an eye for an eye, and so that's why these things are so archetypal. They allow the apes reflect back to us our humanity,
mm,
which is the best science fiction, right? Is able to talk
Mhm.
analogically about things that are too difficult to talk about. And I believe some of the Planet Apes movies in the '70s that went back in time, they were all about race. They were about race, right? They were about
And
discrimination, about segregation. They
mhm.
were about those issues, right? And those are still elements here. But now it's literally come down to an even deeper level. What underpins the effort to discriminate and to segregate, right? It comes
let
down
me ask
to
you this
the lack
question
of
here,
humanity.
because the question I'm going to ask you leads into what you're talking about. And I do want to ask you this question. Cameron, we've had this concept in a lot of IPs where, or let's say even in society, where they say it doesn't matter what a character looks like. We've heard this kind of thrown around a lot.
Mhm.
Everyone should be treated equally, be colorblind.
Sure.
And we've been seeing a lot of this kind of, it doesn't matter who plays the role. It's
Mhm.
irrelevant. We pick the best actress to play this. We don't care what this actress looks like. We just think she was the best person for the part, when we know that in actuality, it's not true. And what's interesting about Planet of the Apes is that it does the opposite. It
Mhm.
actually reflects on how the world is today, in a sense, keeping the consistency of appearances and looks as one of the basic elements of this IP. Do you think in them doing that is the core to the success for this IP, for Planet of the Apes, when it's obvious, everybody notices differences in one another? Do you think that that's why Planet of the Apes is so successful?
Well, I want to answer it on two levels, and I don't want to dominate the conversation. I want to get the perspective of these
No,
lovely.
it's good. It's good. You're not done. It's good. It's good.
I want to throw in. I want to throw. What I do is like to throw in some unusual bombs into the conversation, right? And then, because I make all these analogies to religion and history, which is what my passion is, right? So I want to talk for a second about Malcolm X, right? If you've read the autobiography of Malcolm X or seen the wonderful movie by Spike Lee, there is something that happened to him when he had his pilgrimage to Mecca, and he had a transformation away from sort of the racial separation of the Nation of Islam, and he starts praying with white Muslims and people of other races. He made a comment that's really, I don't think the movie really explores it, but his autobiography explores it, where he actually decided that he made a comment which is actually going to make liberals uncomfortable in the same way it's going to make racists uncomfortable, right? He actually said, what I saw in Mecca was the best way for human beings to interact, which is nobody lost their identity. I saw African pilgrims were hanging out with African pilgrims. You know, Chinese Muslims were hanging out with Chinese Muslims. Americans, we all hung out together. But we had no problem with each other. Everyone went back to the pilgrimage to their own sort of camps where they had the people of their own community that they identified with. But when we came out to do the rituals together, we were all one humanity. But then we went back home to what was familiar to us. And he said, that's okay. Because now I think we've got somewhat of a progressive argument that, you know, just like I watch TV ads, like all ads, you have to have an interracial couple. You can't have two white people together. You can't have two black people. You know, to buy Honda, you've got to have a white guy married to a black woman or Indian woman married to a Chinese guy. I mean, delightful that people find love anywhere. I still think I think the majority of relationships still tend to be ethnically connected in human but there's an effort by Hollywood now to promote, no, everyone's got to mix, right? And Malcolm X was saying, that's not necessary. In fact, that's not even normal. People tend to be drawn to people like themselves. They have a heritage with, they identify with. That's okay. In fact, that's good. But the idea is, how do we work together as human beings while keeping our unique identities? There's nothing wrong with marrying someone of your own race or ethnicity. Not at all. There's nothing wrong. It's human. It's natural. But how do you interact with somebody outside the group, right? So these movies, the other thing that links to that is this idea that Ronald Reagan said in one of his famous speeches to the UN, where Reagan actually said, and a lot of people was like, why was he saying this, right? He was saying, I often wonder if the one thing that will unite humanity will be an alien invasion, right? And so he said that, and it's the President of the United States saying that. People are like, has he lost his mind? But it's actually very profound. He's like that, and we see that in the movie Independence Day, right? Where when the aliens come, Israeli fighter jets and the Iraqi fighter jets going up against spaceship together, right? Because it's human beings now. And that's what this is that when the apes take over, there's no time for, I'm not going to hang out with you because you're a race or your religion or whatever. We got to deal with this, right? We got to deal with this. The race itself, the species is about to be wiped out, right? And so that will guide us. And so in many ways, a crisis like this explores that, explores how human beings, all divisions are perhaps natural, and at the same time, they dissolve at the face of a unified threat. And again, because I like to throw in religion, there's a verse from the Quran that Muslims the Muslims recite a lot. It's something which is quote, God is saying, "O mankind, we created you from one human, from which we created its mate, and then we divided you into nations and tribes so that you may know each other." So the idea is that God intentionally created all of us from one being, Adam, made that into Adam and Eve, and then created all these incredible races and different languages and cultures and traditions so that we can then learn from each other. The idea is all of our traditions have something to teach each other, and the division is intentional. It's a good thing, right? It's God creating diversity, but we all come from a unity. That unity becomes evident when you have a threat to the entire race. And I think that's what these movies explore.
Interesting.
Good point.
Yeah. And Retro Nerd Girl, in one of the films, we hear one of, I think it's Dr. Zayas who said that that there's an infinite number, and you just know the science fiction nerd and you just goes crazy when you hear it. There's an infinite number of timelines, and you're like, oh my gosh.
Yes.
And I thought about that, and I said, gee, they many of them, not everybody, know this prophecy that's supposed to happen and how things play out, and they have the recordings and all this. And I thought to myself, is there an infinite number of timelines, as the movie implies, or futures? And how relevant is it to how this story feels for the person who's viewing it, and essentially the legacy of this IP?
Well, I mean, it makes you think, it depends on who you are, but for me, it makes me think that, there is a future out there where, the humans did survive, their destructive ways, or maybe another species of animal stepped up to the plate. So there are, sort of like a multiverse of things happening, sort of what we're experiencing in superhero movies, where they're doing all these multiverses. I guess the science is saying that we have different lanes of existence, and possibly there's an existence where I have red hair, and it's or maybe there's another reality where I'm a scientist or a doctor, or something else. So those are all exciting concepts, and that's why this story feels so I feel so connected to the story, and I think that's why it attracts a lot of people to this story. There's not that there's an actual possibility that it could happen, but it's sort of like an what if the world was like this? How would you be able to find survival in all of this?
Mm,
How would you fare against in a world where everyone hated these, talking apes? And would you be a humanitarian at that point and feel like step in and say no, no, no? Or would you be part of the army to destroy the apes? Or if you, let's say, you were an ape, like what would you, with a conscious uh, uh, ability, what would you do if you were facing up against the things that, say, someone like Caesar had to go through in conquest of the planet of the apes, where he was basically like a slave and had to figure out a way to help others that were going through the same thing as he was. And
mhm,
I felt that was like sort of an allegory for slavery and like people uprising of
mhm,
and I think it's that's what movies are about, right? It's the fantasy and the play uh of ideas
mhm,
that, what if this was real? What would happen and how would that play out? And it's always fun to see what different artists, directors, writers come up
mhm.
with. And I don't know, it fills me with a lot of joy and fun to imagine with them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well said. And Lorena, I have to ask this question. And you and I've talked about Planet of the Apes before,
Mhm,
prior to this, and it is a 40-year-old franchise. It doesn't feel like it's over, which is something that's very interesting. It feels like it's a continuous story that is going to continue even after the four of us are gone. It feels like it's going to continue, which is very unique. So I have to ask this question about the movies and
mhm.
everything that we've gotten, is it a magnum opus for cinema?
Hmm, that is an excellent question. I would agree. I would agree, and the reason why is this: it seems to be no matter how many times this particular franchise is updated, there's a ton of interest and buzz
Mhm.
around it. Whether it's what are they going to do that's different from the original, or which one are they going to go with, or what kind of direction are they going to take it, what kind of allegory to modern times are they going to do. It seems like with every incarnation of Planet of the Apes, there's something happening within that period of time. With the 68 version, like you guys were saying, with the Cold War, with that one, with the Tim Burton version, it seems like they were trying to make an analogy with slavery. They kind of took that as well.
Which is
Then
why they ended with Abraham Lincoln as an ape.
exactly, exactly. So they had that. Then with the most recent version, where they're going into genetic engineering, no
Mhm.
matter which one that they do, there is still that thing about humanity
Mhm.
and how destructive is humanity to itself
Mhm.
that primates will wind up taking over with the intelligence that we have. It's such a fascinating it's just such a fascinating point of discussion and a great thing to explore for filmmaking. And I think that's why even if you go back and watch the ones from the late 60s, early 70s, why they were so popular and continue to be popular. It's one of those things in filmmaking where if you mention like Star Trek, we know what you're talking about. Mention Star Wars, well, okay, we know what's going on. Pre sequel trilogy, Planet of the Apes.
You're right.
Me.
We're always gonna
Classic.
watch this, and
Yeah.
I have an image. I have an image in my mind. One of the days, a future Planet of the Apes movie is going to end with, the apes sitting around watching a movie called Planet of the Humans, right?
Ooh,
I just gave the filmmakers the next
nice.
moment, right?
I like
I
that.
love
You've
it.
got to write that. You've
That's
got to
Right.
write that.
Let's
You,
see if they approach me to write the script.
you
But
really
Yes.
do. I love that.
Planet of the
Um,
Humans.
guys, what is the legacy of this IP for you, and what do you think its legacy will be going forward for the entire panel? That question.
I'll start. For me, it just I saw this as a kid. I didn't, I wasn't exactly there for the beginning of it, but I did experience some of the hoopla that was going on with the Go Ape. Everybody going crazy for, with costumes and stuff for Halloween, and the whole Go Ape campaign that they had. And it just makes me smile when I think of this franchise. I mean, I was watching an image of one of the chimpanzees shooting a machine gun, and it's so hilarious to me in a weird way. And then to see the chimpanzees on horseback, it's like it just tickles me in a way. So it's like it's so crazy and odd and unusual, that it sparks this interest. And within all of us, I guess we still have a little bit of a primal, there's a primal animal inside of all of us, but it just brings out something really fun. And sometimes when I'm watching and I start pretending I'm a monkey. And I'll actually like, ooh, ooh. And it's so funny because I just feel like it's a franchise for the whole family. Like even kids love this stuff. So yeah, it's great, and they have the benefit of having great storytelling attached to it. So I mean, let's not forget, these movies actually have great stories attached to them.
Absolutely.
and and
Absolutely.
and that's what's really pushing this along. So I mean, for the new movie that's coming out, I hope that they continue that legacy of having good writers and directors
Mhm.
to really give us the entertainment we so desperately want.
Lorena?
Oh, well, really, Retro Nerd Girl kind of pretty much encapsulated it. Just how different and introspective this IP is. There's never, I won't say never, but pretty much, it's not a happy ending type of IP. It makes you question a lot of things about where humanity is going, how we treat, the animal world. I really do hope that when they do this new incarnation, that they keep that struggle in there and that they're very authentic to it, but not beating you over the head with that, because that's not something that the IP ever did. What it did was it put the
No.
arguments out there, it put the situations out there, and it let you make your own conclusion.
Hmm.
So I would love to see that. And I think another thing about this IP, another legacy of it, is making you think about where you are, making you think about how humanity is, even at a basic level, how you treat other humans. So I really do hope that they keep that, because Planet of the Apes is a very cerebral
Yes.
franchise. It's a
Yes.
franchise that inspires a lot of discussion. Retro Nerd Girl, like you were saying, how popular it was. I mean, I remember seeing ads for like toys from the Planet of the Apes. I mean, those
Oh
are like
man.
those are collector items. With pop culture, Dr. Zaius, that's an archetype. That's used a lot. So I love this franchise. It's one of my favorites with respect to science fiction. I'm surprised that I didn't know that Rod Serling had actually written it. I just knew that I just loved it, and I love the Twilight Zone. And again, it's one of those cerebral IPs. I love watching it. That's the one thing that caught me. So hopefully, they will keep that and they won't insult their audience.
And I want to support everything that the lovely ladies on the panel said, and you know, I think that the reason this franchise is never going to go away, I think they'll be making Planet of the Apes movies 100 years from now, right? And they'll be addressing how human beings have screwed up that moment, right? Because we're always screwing up some moment, right? And so they'll be addressing that, you know, and we'll be watching Planet of the Apes on Mars, right? And it'll be how the Martian colonists are overtaken by the apes, right? I mean, it's never going to stop. And so the reason is this, and I'm going to conclude on this. The reason is this because I keep bringing back to religious references. The Planet of the Apes archetype is the archetype of the prophets of the Bible. It is the prophet that shows up, you know, Elijah that shows up to question the King Ahab, who's got everything. He's got wealth, power. He's he's got the whole world there, and it's a world filled with corruption and lies, and and Jezebel is his partner in oppressing people. And Elijah shows up to question that and say, well, what is the truth of the world you're in, and disaster is coming from you. That's the Jeremiah, Isaiah, all of these biblical prophets. They are archetypes. They keep showing up whenever human beings are self-serving, right? John the Baptist, right? He confronts Herod and he's executed, right? Because he tells him the truth. You're doing something wrong. And so the Planet of the Apes franchise is a modern way of having an archetypal prophet show up every generation to critique our smugness, our self-satisfaction, and our inability to understand our role in the cosmos. And I think that's part of what being human is because of our cognitive elevation, is our delusion that with our higher thinking that we are actually all knowing and that we are God, and that is the constant inner delusion that the biblical prophets are critiquing. And I think that's part of what being human is to face that within ourselves. And so this movies are going to keep coming back, and they're going to keep telling the story because they're our way of critiquing the power of the moment, and in a way that's safe through this analogy of animals. And so I think that they're now Planet of the Apes is going to be part of cinematic tradition for the rest of time.
Awesome.
Agreed. I couldn't have said that any better. That certainly definitely involves everything that I would have said too. I just want to thank all three of you for joining me on this foray of the Planet of the Apes IP. Of course, we said it's in anticipation of the new film coming up. And before we end the broadcast, I just want to ask Retro Nerd Girl, where can we find you?
You can find me on my channel, Retro Nerd Girl. I review a lot of old retro movies, and so you can also find me there doing a lot of live streams and watch parties as well.
Do you have a review of Casablanca?
Not yet. I do mostly.
Oh.
I will, but I mostly do science fiction. So but I'll get there eventually.
And Lorena, where can people find you?
Well, folks, you can find me on Twitter, causing all kinds of mischief like I like to do. You can find me on Instagram. And of course, you can find me on YouTube, where I do various videos and live streams that include all of the wonderful people on this panel.
That's great.
And Kamran, where can people find you?
The best place for people to find me right now is on my Patreon, which I believe both and Lorena are part of, and it's getting really crazy and interesting over there because it started off as just me sharing my views on Hollywood, being a screenwriter, and it has evolved now into breaking stories, and we've got all kinds of Disney insiders passing me information about what's really happening. I mean, it's evolved in something I didn't imagine, and it's quite remarkable. And so come join me on the Patreon. It's a way to also communicate with me directly, and I offer screenwriting consulting services or novel consulting services, which people have taken available, and it's helped them. So just I'm sure you'll throw in a link, but it's Patreon/Kamran Pasha. Got my name on the screen. Come join me on there. We've got almost 300 subscribers, and it just keeps increasing. So please join us.
Yes, I certainly am going to put links. You're not seeing them at this moment, but they will be added when I upload this video for everyone. They will be in the description as well as on the screen. But I did want to thank my panelists. This has been such a wonderful event to have the three of you here. I just enjoyed every minute of this. Thank you so much for everything, for being here and for sharing your views and everything. It's just I just loved it. So this is like a dream come true.
So much fun being here.
It's been a
This ended
blast.
up being one of the most sophisticated conversations I've had on YouTube. So thank you for letting me participate in it.
Oh, wow. Well,
Awesome.
I'm so glad to hear that. And I'm glad you enjoyed it. And guys out there who are watching this, thank you for watching. You can find me on Positive Fandom,
Mhm.
my YouTube channel, or you can find me here on the Burn Network as well. So please do find me on those channels and subscribe to my channel as well as everyone else's channels, and links here in the description. So no matter where you are in the galaxy, guys, thank you for watching this. But always do remember to please be kind. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.